1800. Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. The Revolution of 1800 was one of the most famous American political events of the 19th century. It saw Vice President Thomas Jefferson unseat President John Adams, proving once and for all that being the boss doesn't guarantee you get to keep your office. In the first-party system, this election marked a realignment that sent the Federalist Party into a slow, tragic decline and gave rise to the Republican Party, which then ruled for a decade, like an empire, but with a lot more paperwork. This election was a rematch of the 1796 face-off, where the pro-French and pro-decentralization Republicans led by Jefferson and Aaron Burr squared off against the pro-British and pro-centralization Federalists under President Adams and Charles Pinckney. The campaign was so long and contentious that it could have used an intermission and a popcorn stand. Key issues included protests against the levy Congress had enacted to fund the 1798 quasi-war against France, and the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which the Federalists enacted to silence criticism, particularly from Republican newspaper editors who had apparently discovered the art of sarcasm. The Republicans boasted strong local and state affiliates, while the Federalists were disorganized and plagued by the kind of animosity between Alexander Hamilton and President Adams that could only be described as a frenemy relationship for the ages. You could tell it was a modern election by the partisan bickering, regional schisms, and propaganda smear campaigns, because who doesn't love a good old-fashioned mudslinging contest? 1828. Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. President John Quincy Adams went toe-to-toe with Andrew Jackson in the 1828 U.S. presidential election, a contest that could easily be titled the rematch of the century. Adams' National Republicans decided to pair him up with Richard Rush, probably because Rush was the only guy not planning to throw his hat in the Jacksonian ring. By doing so, Adams avoided John C. Calhoun, who had teamed up with the Jacksonians like they were forming a political supergroup. Jackson, riding the momentum from his strong showing in the 1824 election, had the 1828 race practically in the bag. With no other big names stepping up to challenge him, he could have practically taken a victory lap before the ballots were even cast. The support he got from his previous backers, along with the alliance of those who had been rooting for Crawford and Vice President Calhoun, made the Democratic Party look like it was hosting the election's hottest after-party. 1860. Abraham Lincoln versus Stephen A. Douglas. The American Civil War was basically the result of the 1860 presidential election, where political tensions finally boiled over like a too-full pot of grits. In the 1850s, the United States was already a hot mess, deeply divided over slavery in the territories and the question of states' sovereignty, like a family arguing over the remote control, but with much higher stakes. By 1860, the situation reached its breaking point, and the Democratic Party, which had been ruling the roost up until then, split right down the middle along southern and northern lines. This was like watching your favorite band break up before a big concert. As a result, Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party managed to swoop in and grab power without so much as a nod from any southern state. Because who needs a unanimous vote when you've got the North on your side? Within less than a month of Lincoln's election, states like South Carolina were already packing their bags and declaring they were out of the Union, like a teenager storming out of the house. But President James Buchanan and President-elect Abraham Lincoln both waved off these dramatic exits, dismissing the claims as unlawful, basically saying, you can't just quit because you're mad. 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. Nearly every presidential election in U.S. history has had its fair share of drama, but the 1876 race takes the cake. In the popular vote, New York's Samuel J. Tilden actually beat Ohio's Rutherford B. Hayes. Poor Hayes was down 184 electoral votes to 165, with 20 ballots still up in the air. It was like watching a nail-biting sports game where one team is clinging to hope while the other is already celebrating. 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, couldn't seem to make up their minds and claimed their electoral votes for both candidates, like kids on a playground who just can't decide who gets the last swing. To top it off, one elector in Oregon was booted out for being considered unlawful, like a referee throwing a player out of the game for breaking the rules. With those 20 electoral votes still hanging in the balance, the tension was thicker than grandma's gravy. After what must have felt like the longest and most contentious legal and political showdown ever, Hayes eventually came out on top. Historians say the whole mess was finally settled by an informal agreement known as the Compromise of 1877. It was basically like the Republicans saying, fine, you win this one. But in exchange, the Democrats agreed to let Hayes take the presidency, on the condition that Reconstruction would be over and federal troops would pack up and leave the South. This led to the rise of Democratic redeemers in the southern states, who swooped in like they were reclaiming lost territory, all thanks to the compromise. 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt versus Herbert Hoover. In 1932, as the United States was trying to pick itself up from the 1-2 punch of the Great Depression and the 1929 Wall Street crash, the nation held a presidential election. Voters had pretty much decided that President Herbert Hoover was like that one friend who says, "Don't worry, I've got this," but then proceeds to make everything worse. His handling of the economic crisis and prohibition was about as popular as soggy cereal. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, who came in like a breath of fresh air, promising New Deal reforms left and right. He basically said, "Look, folks, I know Hoover's been a mess, but I've got a plan." And the voters were all ears. This election, often called the critical election, was like the grand finale of the fourth party system, also known as the Progressive Era. Roosevelt didn't just win, he trounced Hoover by a wide margin, leaving no doubt that the people were ready for some serious change. Before you could say New Deal, the electorate shifted its loyalty faster than a kid switching to the winning team at recess. They threw their support behind Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, marking the beginning of the fifth party system. Roosevelt's victory wasn't just an election win, it was like the start of a whole new chapter in American politics, with FDR at the helm and Hoover's policies thrown out like last week's leftovers. 1960. John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. In 1960, Dwight D. Eisenhower's 2 terms in office came to an end, and the beginning of a showdown that could have been straight out of a Hollywood script started. On one side, you had Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, a guy who looked like he just stepped off the cover of GQ. On the other side, you had Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who had been vice president under Eisenhower and had turned his office into a national political base, though some might say he was just really good at being everywhere all the time. This election was a nail-biter, with the closest electoral vote since 1916. The popular vote was so tight, you could almost hear the country collectively holding its breath. Kennedy was declared the winner, but only by a margin that was so narrow, even a sheet of paper might have had trouble slipping through. Of course, because it's politics, the whispers started almost immediately. Was there some vote shenanigans in a few states that helped Kennedy clinch the win? Historians are still arguing about that one. And just to keep things interesting, 15 electoral votes were cast for Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia. 14 of those came from the South, where apparently some folks were just not in the mood to pick between Kennedy and Nixon, and one came from Oklahoma, where the elector probably thought, why not shake things up a bit? 1964. Lyndon B. Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. In terms of electoral votes, the 1964 U.S. presidential election was the 6th most lopsided in U.S. history, after 1936, 1984, 1972, 1864, and 1980. In terms of popular vote, it was the 5th most lopsided. After John F. Kennedy's murder, his predecessor Lyndon B. Johnson took office a little over a year later, and he had skillfully linked himself to Kennedy's popularity. Meanwhile, Johnson was effective in casting Arizona Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, who was running against him, as a radical right-winger who sought to do away with social welfare programs like Social Security that had been established in the 1930s. Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty were all introduced after 1965. Thanks to LBJ's advocacy for new programs like these. With these factors working for him, Johnson easily won the presidency, carrying 44 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. As of 2009, Johnson's 22.6 percentage point margin of victory in the popular vote is the 5th largest such margin in presidential election history, after the margins of the 1920 election, 1924 election, 1936 election, and 1972 election. Johnson won 61.1% of the national popular vote, which remains the highest popular vote percentage won by a U.S. presidential candidate since 1820. The election is also remembered due to Goldwater's status as a pioneer in the modern conservative movement. 1980. Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter. In the 1980 U.S. presidential election, Ronald Reagan, the charismatic Republican, squared off against Jimmy Carter, while independent candidate John B. Anderson, also a Republican, decided to join the fun. Thanks to the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran and an economy that seemed to be on a downward spiral, Reagan practically coasted to victory like he was on a Hollywood red carpet. Carter, fresh off his win against Ted Kennedy for the Democratic nomination, tried to paint Reagan as a right-wing extremist, but Reagan, a former California governor with a flair for the dramatic, responded with his signature smile and a few well-timed zingers, making Carter's criticism seem more like punchlines to his jokes. On top of that, the Republicans managed to take control of the Senate for the first time in 28 years, adding an extra dose of drama to the election. Reagan's landslide victory was so impressive that it gave birth to what many folks now call the Reagan Revolution. 1992, Bill Clinton versus George H.W. Bush. In 1992, the race for the U.S. presidency became a three-ring circus with Republican George H.W. Bush, Democratic nominee Bill Clinton from Arkansas, and independent wildcard Ross Perot from Texas, all vying for the top job. Bush, who had famously declared, "Read my lips, no new taxes," in 1988, might as well have added, "Just kidding," when he broke that promise. This little flip-flop didn't exactly endear him to conservatives, who felt more betrayed than a cat left out in the rain. Adding to Bush's woes, the economy was in a slump, and the foreign policy victories he once proudly boasted about, like a shiny trophy collection, had lost their luster. With the Soviet Union out of the picture and the Middle East relatively calm after Iraq's defeat in the Gulf War, voters were less impressed with Bush's international credentials. It seemed like Bush was trying to sell snow boots in the desert. 2008, Barack Obama versus John McCain. On November 4, 2008, the United States conducted its 56th quadrennial presidential election. The campaign revolved on the policies and actions of outgoing Republican President George W. Bush, as well as the public's yearning for change. An agenda of change and reform in Washington was advanced by the major party candidates throughout the presidential election campaign. Following the financial crisis of 2008, domestic policy and the economy became the primary concerns of candidates in the final months of the campaign. Party member the Republican John McCain was beaten by Barack Obama, who was then a junior senator from Illinois. 9 states switched sides since 2004. They all helped Obama win a large majority in the Electoral College in 2004 by voting for the Republican candidate. On December 15, 2008, the democratically chosen representatives from all 50 states plus D.C. cast ballots for the nation's top 2 executive officers. On January 8, 2009, a joint session of Congress counted the ballots. With 365 electoral votes, Obama defeated McCain, who garnered 173. 2016, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. The 2016 election, the 58th quadrennial American presidential showdown, felt more like a reality TV finale than a traditional political contest. On one side, you had the Republican duo of businessman Donald Trump and Indiana Governor Mike Pence, and on the other, the Democratic ticket featuring former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Virginia Senator Tim Kaine. Despite Clinton scooping up around 2.9 million more votes nationwide, Trump managed to pull off an electoral college victory, proving that sometimes it's not about how many people show up to your party, but who brings the best snacks. Trump won 30 states with 306 pledged electors out of 538, flipping perennial swing states like Florida, Iowa, and Ohio, and even tearing down the so-called blue wall of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This trio of states had been as reliably Democratic as your grandmother's voting habits since the 1990s. Leading up to the election, most media forecasts suggested that a Trump victory was as likely as finding a needle in a haystack, if that haystack were on fire, and the needle was made of chocolate. But as they say, the only poll that matters is the one on Election Day, and Trump proved to be the ultimate dark horse, galloping all the way to the White House. 2020, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. The 2020 election, the 59th quadrennial presidential contest, was like the Super Bowl of democracy, except with more yard signs and fewer touchdowns. The Democratic duo of former Vice President Joe Biden and California Senator Kamala Harris faced off against the Republican ticket of incumbent President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence in a showdown that had everyone on the edge of their socially distanced seats. In a twist that had history buffs nodding knowingly, Trump became the first U.S. president since George H.W. Bush in 1992 to lose a bid for a second term. Biden, on the other hand, not only won, but managed to score the highest percentage of the popular vote of any challenger since 1932, proving that sometimes slow and steady really does win the race, especially when the other guy spends most of the race tweeting. The 2020 election also broke records for voter turnout, with more Americans casting their ballots than in any other election since 1900. In fact, both of the main tickets received more votes than any previous candidates, which either means people were really motivated this time around, or they finally figured out how to use the internet to register to vote. 2024, Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. The Americans are going to see the 60th heated presidential contest between two heavyweights, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, on 5th of November, 2024. Originally, it looked like we were in for a 2020 rematch, with Trump squaring off against Democratic incumbent Joe Biden. But then Biden had a debate performance that can only be described as yikes. It was so bad that Democrats started wondering if Biden could even find the Oval Office, let alone lead the country. By July 21st, Biden threw in the towel and passed the torch, or maybe the headache, to his vice president, Kamala Harris, with his full endorsement. On the other side, Trump's record is looking like a game of political Jenga that's about to topple over. After his followers tried to pull the old switcheroo with the 2020 election results, he's now facing federal charges related to that scheme. And let's not forget the whole hush money scandal from his 2016 campaign. Things got even wilder when a 20-year-old gunman took a shot at Trump during a Pennsylvania rally on July 13th, grazing his ear. It was like a scene out of a political thriller, except this is real life, folks. Politicians on both sides begged everyone to calm down after the attempt on Trump's life. For a brief moment, Trump seemed to dial down the drama, but true to form, he's back at it, stirring the pot with his usual brand of fiery rhetoric at his rallies. Which of these elections do you think had the most unexpected outcome, and why? We are looking forward to seeing your views in the comment section. After exploring every significant US election in our latest video, we're diving into the world of amazing medical breakthroughs. Discover the innovations transforming healthcare and making a difference in lives worldwide. Don't miss out. Hit the link to watch and stay tuned for more fascinating content.